Out of the Death Zone, the amazing true story of 13-year-old Poorna Malavath and her quest to climb the world's highest mountain, by Kristen Lewis. 13-year-old Poorna Malavath was climbing to the top of the world, the summit of Mount Everest. Towering more than 29,000 feet above sea level, Everest is the tallest mountain on Earth. If Poorna made it, she would be the youngest girl ever to reach the top. But first, she would have to make it through the Death Zone. The Death Zone begins at 26,000 feet. It's so named because no human can live long at that altitude. The air is so thin, there isn't enough oxygen to breathe. The brain gets foggy. The body starts to slowly die. On May 24th, 2014, Poorna began her trek through the Death Zone. She and her team of fellow climbers trudged single file along a narrow, wind-battered ridge. Poorna's muscles ached. She felt dizzy. The bitter cold seemed to seep through her gloves and clothing. Every step took enormous effort. She wanted to stop and rest, but on Everest, stopping can mean the difference between living and dying. Keep going, she told herself. Just keep going. The first attempts. Mount Everest rises from the Himalayan mountains like an icy arrow pointing to the sky. The Himalayas are a vast mountain range that stretches for some 1,500 miles through India, China, and several other countries. People began attempting to summit Everest in the 1920s. Looking at historical photographs, it's striking to compare the gear of these early climbers to the gear that Poorna and her other climbers use today. Back in the 1920s, there were no high-tech shoes to help mountaineers trek across Everest's treacherous glaciers and icy, rocky slopes. There was no lightweight performance clothing designed for sub-zero temperatures. Yet a few climbers managed to get close to the top, most famously the British mountaineer George Mallory. But it cost Mallory his life. He and his climbing partner, Andrew Irvine, died on Everest in 1924. It was not until 1953 that two men reached the summit and made it back to tell the tale. Tenzing Norgay from Nepal and Sir Edmund Hillary from New Zealand. Today, nearly 70 years later, their accomplishment is still considered one of the greatest feats in exploration history. Over the next several decades, few mountaineers dared to follow in Norgay's and Hillary's footsteps. By the 1990s, however, a number of adventure companies had begun taking people to the top. For the first time, it became possible for less experienced climbers to attempt Everest. It could cost more than $50,000 to be guided up the mountain. Today, some companies charge upwards of $100,000. Soon, though, troubling reports began to circulate. Trash was piling up on Everest. There were so many climbers that traffic jams were forming near the top. Hillary himself spoke out, saying that Everest had become a circus. Many feared that it was only a matter of time before a catastrophe struck, and in 1996 it did. A sudden blizzard descended on climbers near the summit. 8 people died. Over the years, some 300 people have died on Everest. Those who die on Everest usually remain where they fall, their bodies eerily preserved in the cold, dry air, because removing them is so difficult and dangerous. Poorna knew she could see corpses along the way, but the sight still rattled her. It was a shocker, she remembers. The opportunity. When Poorna was growing up, she never dreamed that she would one day attempt to climb the tallest mountain in the world. In fact, she had never even seen a mountain. Poorna was born in a farming village in Telangana, a state in India. The region is warm and dry, nothing like the snow-covered mountains of the Himalayas. At school, she proved to be a natural athlete, excelling in volleyball and in track and field. One day, she heard about a rock climbing program in a nearby city. Poorna didn't know exactly what rock climbing was, but it seemed fun to her, and her parents agreed to let her go. They were eager for their daughter to see the world outside their village, and to have the opportunities they never had. Along with about 100 other students, Poorna learned the basics of rock climbing, such as how to rappel, using a rope to come down a cliff. She loved everything about the program and finished at the top of her class. Little did Poorna know how impressed her rock climbing instructors had been with her and the others. It was decided that a group of students would be sponsored to continue their training, with the eventual goal of attempting to climb Everest. There were no guarantees, though. Not every student would make the cut to join the Everest expedition. At each step of the way, the students would be evaluated for their physical, mental, and emotional strength. Only the most qualified would be chosen. To Poorna, it all sounded like an incredible adventure. The mountain. In the death zone, a line of climbers wait to reach the summit. In recent years, the summit has become overcrowded, creating dangerous traffic jams. The training. Over the next few months, Poorna learned how to ice climb and survive in harsh, sub-freezing conditions. When she saw snow for the first time, she said it felt like heaven. She also got to climb her first peak, a 17,000-foot tall mountain in the Himalayas. In the end, only 2 students were selected for the Everest addiction, Poorna and Anand Kumar, 17. Both would need 3 more months of training, daily workouts that included running, strengthening exercises, and yoga, as well as meditation to prepare their minds. If they were going to climb Everest, they would need endurance, skill, and grit. First, though, Poorna would need her parents' permission. My coach told my parents that it was dangerous, and I might not return, but that it was a breathtaking adventure, Poorna remembers. My father said I was ready and gave his permission. My mother cried and said no, but I convinced her. I promised her I would come back. But would Poorna be able to keep that promise? The risks. There are many ways to die on Mount Everest. An avalanche of snow, ice, and rock can barrel down the mountain and bury climbers. Hurricane-force winds can knock climbers down and freeze them to death. Then there's the height. Altitude illness can cause the brain to swell and the lungs to bleed. Exhaustion is a constant struggle, and it can be lethal. Climbers have been known to get so tired that they sit down and never get up again. Given the risks, there has been growing concern about young people on Everest. An increasing number of teenagers have been attempting to reach the summit. Most famously, Jordan Romero, who summited Everest at age 13 in 2010. Some critics had said that teenagers lacked the judgment needed to make the climb, and that the high altitude could harm developing brains and bodies. But Poorna was confident that her training had prepared her for anything she might encounter. She also wouldn't be alone. She would have a team of experts supporting her. Her coach, Babu Shakar, a professional mountaineer who had already climbed Everest several times, and a group of highly skilled Sherpa guides. The Sherpa are a people native to the region and are accustomed to living at high altitudes in the Himalayas. From the first expeditions, Sherpas have guided foreigners up the mountain. The expedition. Because of the dangers of altitude illness, no one can climb to the top of Everest in one big push. Instead, the mountain must be climbed in stages. Camps are set up along the way. At each camp, climbers rest while they acclimatize, that is, while their bodies adjust to the altitude. An expedition up Everest usually takes about 2 months. Poorna arrived at the first camp in early April. It was then that she received troubling news. An avalanche had just killed 7 Sherpas on a different part of the mountain. She was sad and frightened, but Poorna put any thought of giving up out of her mind. I had to prove that girls could do anything, she says. Over the next month, Poorna and her team made their way from camp to camp. Their route would be from the north, the same route Mallory had attempted nearly 100 years earlier. Along the way, Poorna saw spectacular views. She remembers one night when she couldn't sleep, and she stepped outside. Far above any pollution or light from the cities, the sky was lit with more stars than Poorna had ever seen, and it was magnificent. By the end of May, the team was approaching the final leg of the expedition and preparing to make a push for the summit. The climbing had been grueling. Strong winds blasted them. Even talking was tiring. At one point, they had to cross over a crevasse, a deep cavern in the ice, using a ladder. Any slip could send them tumbling to their deaths. By the time they reached the final camp, Poorna was exhausted. The climb. Everest Base Camp, where climbers spend days or even weeks letting their bodies get used to the high altitude. The death zone. Around 9 p.m. on May 24th, Poorna and the team set out for the summit. It can take 8 hours to reach the top, and they needed to be back down before the afternoon, when dangerous storms are more likely. They roped themselves together and stepped out into the freezing darkness. Like most climbers, they had oxygen canisters to help them breathe. Looking up, Poorna could see how close she was to the top. But then the dizziness set in. She told one of the Sherpa guides that she wanted to stop and rest. He urged her to keep going, but she was starting to falter. Finally, they found a place to sit, and he checked her oxygen canister. It was empty. He gave her a fresh can, and Poorna gulped down air. I could see my goals above me, she said. I could not turn back. For the next few hours, they pressed on, higher and higher into the freezing air. Wind whipped at their bodies, but Poorna kept going, thinking of her family and friends back home, who were rooting for her and counting on her to return. Finally, she stepped onto the summit, a narrow ridge at the top of the world. As she gazed around her at the spectacular view, she saw the curvature of the earth. It was a surreal feeling, Poorna said. The view was an ocean of ice-capped mountains. She unfurled the Indian flag and sang the Indian national anthem. After posing for a few photographs, it was time to leave, to begin the long journey back home. The summit. Poorna and one of her guides posed for a photo at the top of the world. Poorna wore special boots with spikes on the bottom to help her stay steady in the ice and snow. The look ahead. News of Poorna's triumph quickly spread around the world, and her life was forever changed. Reporters interviewed her on TV. A book was written about her, and a movie was made. She gave a TED Talk focusing on what it takes to reach your goals. This past May, Poorna graduated from college with a degree in political science. Since her Everest feat, she has climbed 6 more mountains and plans to climb a 7th soon. People often ask her why she decided to climb Everest. I never decided to climb Everest, she said. A better way to put it is, the Sagarmatha Kolomungo blessed me to climb her.